Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Eddrick Show. I am your host, Eddrick Jerome. This is the place for intelligent conversation with interesting people. Go ahead, hit that subscribe button, drop a like, leave me a comment, and let me know how I'm doing as I bring this interesting content to you each and every week. This one is a special edition to the Eddrick Show because my guests are Akwasi Owusu-Bempah and Tahira Rehmatullah, authors of the new book, Waiting to Inhale: Cannabis Legalization and the Fight for Social Justice. Akwasi is a professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Toronto, an affiliate scientist at Canada's Centre for Addiction and Mental Health, and the director of research for the Campaign for Cannabis Amnesty. Tahira is a partner at Highlands Venture Partners, co-founder and CEO of Commons, and a member of the board of directors of Akerna Corporation and Last Prisoner Project. She is often referred to in the trade press as the most powerful woman in cannabis. Welcome to the show, both of you.
Nice to be with you.
Let me start out, as I was mentioning to you guys before we came on, an exhaustive, thoroughly researched book. You pack quite a bit of concepts and thought-provoking questions and research and history into your work. But let me start at the beginning. How did you two come together around this topic, and what motivated you guys to collaborate on such a great book?
Yeah, it's a nice story. Tahira, do you want to kick things off?
Sure. So Akwasi and I first actually met at a conference at McGill University in 2018, and the content of the conference was predominantly regulatory policy driven, and I was one of maybe two people who were more on the business side, also presenting. And funnily enough, and we talk a little bit about this in the book, is that Akwasi presented the first day, I was presenting the second day, and after hearing his remarks, I realized that I needed to rewrite my entire presentation because so much of what we were saying was so similar, but coming from kind of different sides, and not necessarily thinking that there would be that much more overlap. So that started a great friendship, and Akwasi actually was considering, writing a book and had asked me to collaborate with him on that, and it kind of evolved from there. So it's been a long running project of ours that we really started in 2019, and Akwasi reminded me we saw each other for the first time in person last week since 2019 because COVID hit. We did most of this actually during that time frame where we were in remote lives, and I felt like I'd seen him so much that I didn't realize that we actually hadn't seen each other in person for that long. So it's nice to be able to do this together. But it was really bringing in the two different sides of. And there are many sides to the cannabis industry and legalization, but from his experience as an focus on education policy regulation, and we can, Akwasi, you should talk all about your background, but then my lens as well from actually operating in the business side. And I've been in this space since 2014 and have had different experiences kind of around the table. And what we kept coming to is just how the industry has made such great advancements, but at the same time, the real issues are not being addressed. And that's what we wanted to highlight in this book and bring those narratives forward, really humanize and kind of demystify what's happening, so people have a greater understanding on the impact that the war on drugs and how did the cannabis plant actually come to be illegal and now legal, to really tell the stories of those people who've been engaged in it.
Historically, the so-called war on drugs, as you mentioned, has always targeted Black and brown people. One of the interesting aspects of your book that I really enjoyed was that you highlight how this has been a global phenomenon, not just here in America, but it has really happened across the world. Can you discuss a few of the common issues and themes on the war on drugs, and the devastating impact it's had on Black and brown communities that are global in nature?
Yeah. So why don't I hop in here? So, I'm trained as a criminologist, and that's the area that I work in now. And I really came into this first, someone who was studying, racism and racial disparities in policing. And you can't do that without looking at the enforcement of drug laws, and particularly cannabis. It's the most widely used drug in many countries, legal drug anyway. And we see it, largely as a gateway into the criminal justice system for our most marginalized populations. As you've mentioned, drug law enforcement generally and the war on drugs in particular has deeply racist roots. I'm here in Canada now. Our first drug laws were designed to target Asian populations and Indigenous populations. And the very same thing was occurring in the United States at the turn of the 20th century. There were concerns around Mexican immigrants. There were concerns around Asian immigrants. There were concerns around the Black population. And attaching the use of a drug to those populations and then criminalizing that drug is a very easy way to then control that population through law enforcement, through criminalization, and ultimately through incarceration. And that's what we've seen, right? Since the start of the war, since the start of Prohibition, and I'll distinguish the Prohibition from the war on drugs.
Sure,
because,
sure.
Drugs have been illegal now, the illicit substances that we're talking about, for about 100 years, opium and cannabis and cocaine. The war on drugs was really, a set of policies and an approach that gained traction in the 1970s following Richard Nixon's declaration of a war on drugs. But from the start, it has targeted Black and brown people, racialized people. And we see those in the data. And in terms of the impact that those have had, so even though rates of cannabis use are relatively similar across racial groups, we see, irrespective of the jurisdiction, that Black and brown people are hugely overrepresented in arrests, in charges and convictions, and ultimately behind bars. And that criminalization has an impact not only on those individuals who have a more difficult time completing their education. It's harder for them to get jobs, to secure housing, to volunteer, to travel, really just to navigate social life. But it impacts their families too, right? Because that's another individual who cannot contribute to their family in the way that they could, and another individual who cannot contribute to those communities in the way that they otherwise could. And so we see social deprivation in communities being fueled by this war on drugs. At the same time, the war on drugs has really kind of supercharged and expanded the criminal justice system itself. So when we talk about the militarization of policing, how's that come about? In part because the police have these wars that they're waging, and so they're equipped to fight those wars. And so we see huge amounts of resources being taken out of communities and being fed towards criminal justice institutions like the police, the courts, and correctional agencies. And so people are funneled by the police into the criminal justice system. And then ultimately, as we see in the correctional data as well, hugely overrepresented behind bars for cannabis-related crimes, as well as other drug offenses, of course. But this then again has even more of an impact, because when you're incarcerated, you're removed from your families. Mm-hmm. It severs ties between families and friends, and it's really difficult to reintegrate back into society.
One of the aspects of that you guys write about extensively regarding criminal convictions is the concept of expungement and the need for expungement of criminal records for people who aren't really, in there for violent crimes. Can you talk about the concept of what expungement is and why it's so important for the fight for social justice?
Yeah. Why don't I kick off expungement, and then you can talk about some of the other solutions. So we lay out really 3 solutions in the book to deal with the harms of prohibition that I'm sure we'll get to. The first of those is expungement. So as we move towards and ultimately adopt legalization, we believe, as do many others, that it's only fair and really sensible that the criminal records people have for things and activities that are no longer illegal are erased, are cleared by the government, and there's a process for them to do that. And the reason for this is, of course, it deals with the problems that people with criminal records have that I've spoken about before. There are some novel ways to do this. We've seen in first piloted in San Francisco and then adopted in other jurisdictions. Governments partnering, for example, with Code for America, who's developed a tool called Clear My Record. It's a AI tool that jurisdictions can let loose on their criminal records that can itself identify cannabis-related crimes, those convictions for things that are no longer illegal, and file those files with the courts so that those records can ultimately be cleared. And so this is, providing individuals with a second chance, really, and erasing, as we titled that chapter in the book, Erasing the Past.
And one thing to add there, so many people have heard that President Biden in October of 2022 announced these pardons that affected people who were convicted of cannabis possession at the federal level. That really only impacted about 6,500 people. And that's not saying that that's a bad number, but there are still probably about 40,000 people at best estimates, which the information is also a little bit patchy, but at least we would say about 40,000 people who are still impacted. And those are people who are really at the state level. So actually most convictions happen at the state level in the US, not at the federal level, which is why people thought that that was a wide pardon and that, all of these people are going to be released, but that's actually not the case. And so it's important for people to understand the levels that a lot of these charges happen, and that it's really a calling on the governors of those states to produce similar, enact similar pardons regarding state cannabis offenses versus those federal ones. There are about additional 3,000 people that are convicted at higher level cannabis crimes at the federal level. So large trafficking, some violence, things along those lines. But at the state level, again, groups are working to get people out of prison, like the Last Prisoner Project, on an organization that I'm on the board on, because those, as Akwasi is saying, it's a process to get these expungements and pardons done. And so it kind of takes this hands-on approach, and every state is actually different in how things are managed. And so it has to be done. We're hoping for more resources like these AI programs to be able to allow for a much more fell swoop impact than having to go in one by one.
And to add another layer to that,
Sure.
that 3,000 people are folks that are currently serving sentences at the state level that could be cleared. When we look at kind of historically, we start to get into not only perhaps the tens of thousands, but the hundreds of thousands. So when you look across the country and across time, if we were to have federal legalization now and the states were to adopt expungement measures similar to that the federal government has, we would get into even greater numbers. And so it expands, depending on exactly what it is that we're looking at.
And that would have such an impact just economically. People be able to come out and get gainful employment and be with their families. And so it leads me kind of to my next question, which is just the social injustice of this, I guess, plague, if you will, in the criminal justice system, my words. But you guys write about social equity initiatives and trying to rectify that. So can you guys talk to me about social equity initiatives and how vital they are to the campaign for legalization?
Yeah, I'm happy to start off there. One element that Akwasi and I continuously talk about is that as legalization continues, and as has happened kind of in the past couple of years, one important element is that social equity, whatever that may be, and it encompasses a whole range of initiatives, right? Like, what does that mean to different people? But the reality is that it has to be part of the DNA of whatever regulation and policy that we're rolling out, because trying to implement something later, quite frankly, it just doesn't happen, but it's also much more challenging to actually enact those types of measures. So we outline a couple of different states in the US that have actually tried to do various social equity programs. And in addition to that, we highlight towards the end that New York at that time was pending, and now we're seeing it actually play out. And unfortunately, nothing is a gold standard quite yet. There's a lot that has to be established, and it quite frankly ends up in delays and lawsuits, and that's what we've been seeing. All hope is not lost, because there's faster iteration that is happening to correct the inaccuracies of that program. But what social equity measures really allow to do is to provide people who have been impacted by the war on drugs, whose communities and family members have been impacted, to step to the front of the line in some way, shape, or form, be it you're at the top of the list for getting a license in one of the categories, be it retail, cultivation, along those lines, to be able to participate in different ways. The challenge has become that not only moving someone to the front of the line necessarily has the impact that you want, because at the end of the day, they still have to run a business. And the resources that come with needing to run a business, financial, operational, regulatory compliance, policy, those are still things that are really limited to certain groups of people, and namely people who have the funding or the connections to be able to do that, which continues to be limited into a smaller population that we see in other industries as well. So it just unfortunately has replicated itself in the cannabis industry. But we still believe that these measures are absolutely necessary in order to get those people engaged. And one of the other elements is just getting more diversity in leadership, not just people who are, throughout the ranks in organizations, but leadership as well, because that is what is going to have the longer term impact on who's in the industry, who's participating, whose voices are being heard, and whose communities are actually being impacted.
As a follow-up, you also write that federal legalization here in the United States has the potential to be possibly detrimental to some of the social equity programs. So can you discuss some of the reasons why that might happen?
So I'll jump in a little bit there. So with federal legalization, on one side, it opens the doors. It allows for safer banking, transactions that can go across state lines. But with that too, the policies that are put in place to allow for some people to advance with social equity, to have more control over their region or have their retail environments, it becomes a bigger challenge at times when you have the large organizations coming in who maybe couldn't previously participate. There's still hundreds of organizations who won't touch cannabis because of that federal illegality. There'll be multinational organizations, investment firms that won't necessarily engage. Actually, most banks won't still bank cannabis or even CBD, even though CBD is legal from hemp-derived, 2018 Farm Bill. But because of that, there's still people who are outside of the industry, allowing for others to grow and proliferate in a way that maybe they wouldn't have had the opportunity to. So there are those things to consider. On everybody wants federal legality, but at the same time, we have to consider, how do you safeguard the steps that have been taken with social equity, and how do we ensure that those people aren't completely wiped out when you have billion-dollar organizations coming in to compete with them.
You highlight the stories of several people throughout the history of the legalization campaign, and some people even current today. One of the people I wanted to ask you guys to talk about is the young lady named Wanda James. Why is Wanda James such an important figure in the legalization process, and why did you guys decide to write about her in the book?
Well, I was going to, Tahira, I think I passed this to you because I think you got much closer connection than I do as well. So,
well, Wanda's interesting because she has a great educational background, military family, and is a Black woman who also has experienced some of the pushback, and not only as someone who's Black, but somebody who's a woman. And then also over time learned that she has a brother who was actually incarcerated for cannabis and the challenges that he faced. She's been a leading voice in the industry for longer than many people have even been in the quote unquote industry, and was the first Black woman to have a cannabis dispensary that is still thriving to this day. And she's really become a voice for the industry. But one of her biggest goals has always been to get other people involved, make sure that we're raising the bar to allow everybody into the industry, but particularly people of color and women. So she's someone who's just that person that has really led the charge, took a lot of risks early on. Her and her husband have been doing this for quite some time, but to really be, she's someone who is an example of a first, who continues to advance and move, and quite frankly, bring people along with her, which we can't say that many people are doing. We also talk about Al Harrington in the book, who is a former NBA player who's similarly doing something like that. He wants to bring other people along, and it's not just about them, it's about the broader community that can have an impact, because they come from the areas where they understand how communities have been destroyed. They've seen it in their own lives and their families, and they want to create change, and that's actually what they're doing.
You mentioned banking and the importance of being able to take out a business loan to get into this business, which federally you cannot do at this particular time. Can you speak to where federal legalization is here in the United States right now, given the current political environment? I mean, a couple of years ago, there was a lot of momentum. The Democrats had the House, the Senate, and the presidency, and people were thinking that maybe there was an opportunity to loosen up some of the federal laws around legalization. That kind of didn't happen. So where are we now, especially with the interesting political environment we have here in the United States right now?
So we are, unfortunately, I would say we're kind of at the same place we were every year around this time. There have been different measures put in place that have been voted down. Safe banking is something that it's come around the table so many times, and that really is focused on allowing for measures to allow banks to participate, for people to have bank accounts. You mentioned, Eddrick, loans. The average cannabis business can't get a loan you can't get a small business loan, you can't get larger loans. And really the only organizations that have loans in the industry are very large organizations that have, billions of dollars behind them, but also those who come from, now there have been established loan funds within cannabis that exclusively focus on that. So there's still, the average point of sale processing, banking, we can't use credit cards, all of that stuff that a small business that's selling widgets could easily have access to. We don't have access to those. at the federal level, the conversation has kind of gone in circles, whereas we understand now that this is much more of a bipartisan issue than we previously had thought. It wasn't, we thought that, only Democrats support this. There are actually a lot of Republicans who are in favor for a range of reasons, but there hasn't been a real measure to remove some of the challenges. Like tax law 280E is something that is at the federal tax, which actually is, if you're an illegal business, you still have to pay taxes, but your tax rate is substantially larger than the average business. And that really makes it challenging for businesses to operate. So we don't necessarily, and I don't necessarily anticipate federal legalization happening in the next couple of years, certainly not under the Biden administration. We'll see what happens with whatever the next administration is, but it doesn't seem to be the priority. Unfortunately, there are a lot of other things that are becoming priority, but with that, the hope is that we can get some of the other bills passed that allow for ease in day-to-day business operations that allow businesses to thrive.
And let me ask you, Akwasi, you write about your personal story. You really go into some of the things that you've gone through growing up and some of the things you were exposed to and how that, kind of shaped how you view things now. So talk to me a little bit about, Canada and the way you grew up and maybe some of the things you've learned now that you want to share with folks even more.
Yeah, thank you. So as I note in the book, I was actually born in the United Kingdom. I moved to Canada when I was quite young, and my neighbor when I moved to Canada was a retired cop, and he kind of glorified the job, and I'd watched Beverly Hills Cop too many times, and so I went from this place where the police walk around the streets and largely walk wearing funny hats and don't have sidearms to having this guy that would tell me all these stories about the work he had done. So I went through many of my formative years wanting to be a cop, even though I'd seen in the cities that I lived in England some pretty serious problems related to crack and heroin, which were kind of spiking in the early 1990s, and where I grew up in Ontario, lots of cannabis grow ops around me. But I always had this interest in law enforcement, but saw people around me that were engaging in drug use and certainly in drug trafficking. And we've got plenty of movies and TV shows around these things. They are also very interesting. I went away to university, wanted to be a cop, as I've said, and realized very quickly that the kind of rosy picture that I had of policing was exactly that. It was rosy. The things that my father had been telling me, that some of the interactions that I'd had with the police that weren't overly positive, kind of pushed me in a different direction. And racial profiling really emerged as a social phenomenon here in Canada when I was studying to become a cop. And so I really changed my focus and wanted to study injustice in our justice system. And as I said, kind of off the top, you can't do that without looking at our drug laws. And I got, just like really engrossed in this study of how drugs became illegal and the impact that those have had. And then I had the fortune to go to Indiana University for my first academic position. And I met a young man who'd spent much of his late teen years and early 20s in California, actually in and out of correctional institutions for trafficking cannabis. And he was like, look, I know Canada's going to legalize. We've got legalization here. You really need to look at these social equity initiatives that are taking place. And so I started, kind of really investigating those. And so I got to see from my chronological background just the devastation that the war on drugs has caused, and really this whole infrastructure around the criminal justice system that has grown as a result of our drug laws, as well as I could see the huge potential that legalization could have to remedy some of those problems. And we've talked about some of these already, of course, the clearing of criminal records, inclusion in the legal industry. But one of the other big ones, and where I see a lot of potential, is actually reinvestment of some of the revenues from legal cannabis back into those communities most harmed. So as I've said, largely racialized, largely kind of poorer communities have been targeted for drug law enforcement. There have been billions poured into enforcing those laws, money taken out of those communities, either from deinvestment from social services or as a result of those people, again, not being able to engage in employment and other things in the way that they could. Now, when we look at the tens and hundreds of millions of dollars that are coming in different jurisdictions from legal cannabis sales, we can see that, if a portion of those sales, 5, 10, 15, 20% are taken and put into funds, as they are in Illinois, for example, they can then be used and directed to organizations and groups who are doing the very work that will repair the harms that we've identified that have been caused by the war on drugs. So programming around education for youth in these areas, job skills and employment programs, health programs, crime prevention and reintegration programs. And so, one of the things that I've learned is that the war on drugs was hugely disastrous in terms of the impact that it's had on communities. It was hugely beneficial if you're a police agency, a private prison, or a politician who's campaigned on these promises. But despite all the devastation, there is a lot of hope and a lot of promise that legalization brings with it. As Tahira has noted, those hopes and those promises only come if it's done correctly, and that's part of why we lay out this roadmap in the book of how that might happen.
We have a couple of minutes left, and I want to ask you now. It's challenging to stay on top of everything that's going on in the legalization movement, especially here in the United States. Where do you guys go? I mean, you've done this exhaustive research for the book, but where do you guys get your information? If someone wanted to stay current and not rely, quote unquote, on Yahoo News and this and that, where do you guys get information and current information about, where the legalization movement is, and how do you stay on top of it?
It's a challenge. I'm an academic, so I often go to academic sources, which are notoriously delayed, but also social media, of course, following kind of the major cannabis and drug reform organizations and media outlets, so like Leafly, Benzinga, Business of Cannabis, and things like that. There are a number of people. Jeff Burke, for example, is a reporter who's covered this beat for a long time, a journalist, and so they're often sharing updates on their Twitter and other social media platforms. So I focus on the academic and kind of gray literature, as we call it, the government reports for kind of what's happening big picture, but in terms of the specifics and the up to date, for me, it's really social media and these kind of key outlets. Tahira?
Yeah, similar to me. For me, I attend a lot of the industry conferences as well, where you can hear things that are not necessarily being reported on today, but things that are in process, both at the business level, the regulatory policy level as well. It's a good mix. So try to stay current in addition to the content that you can actually read, but by actually attending and talking to people who are in the space, because some of that stuff, as Akwasi said, it takes a bit longer for that to hit news pages. And so the dialogue is important. And organizations like Last Prisoner Project, the ACLU, the ones who are really embedded in this type of work, have been great resources as well. And they try to stay current so people can understand what trends are happening and what they're seeing, even though research often takes a lot longer.
Well, again, go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say the Drug Policy Alliance, NORML. I'd like to say just one more thing, because I think we're going to wrap up here. And that's, one of the things we end on in the book is that, cannabis legalization, we've got it federally here where I am in Canada. It's taken hold, obviously, in many American states, and we're seeing it around the world. But it's, we think really just the first step in terms of broader drug law reform. And, we've seen some nods to this in the United States already, with the Biden administration saying it expects MDMA to be approved for the treatment of certain mental illness. And so we lay out this roadmap for cannabis, and we want to see this happen with respect to cannabis legalization. But we also think that these roadmaps that we've laid out should also inform the legalization of other drugs, which, we believe is really inevitable.
Well said. Well, again, I want to thank you guys for the book. It's thoroughly researched. It's a great read. I encourage folks to go out, because it does give you different perspectives. And as I say, for me, my biggest takeaway was just the global nature of this problem or this situation, which, we tend to be a little myopic here in the United States. We tend to focus only on what's in front of us, but there's a whole large world out there where people are struggling with some of the same issues. So I want to thank you guys and congratulate you on the work.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. If people want more information about the two of you or the book, where can they go?
So we're both on social media, LinkedIn. I'm Tahira Rem, and Akwasi is Owusu-Bempah on most platforms. And then also the book, which links out to a lot of places, is MIT Press website, where you can find a lot of information about the book on there.
Yeah, book's also on Amazon and
Barnes and Noble.
Barnes and Noble.
Yeah.
Your local retail outlet as well, hopefully soon too.
And I'm assuming it's printed on hemp paper. I'm just kidding.
Don't smoke it.
just
Someday.
But I do want to thank you guys for coming on the Eddrick Show, and I appreciate you taking the time to talk with me today.
Thank you very much.
This has been another edition of the Eddrick Show. I am your host, Eddrick Jerome. I do want to thank you for tuning in. This is the place for intelligent conversation with interesting people. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Look for us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all your favorite online streaming platforms as I bring you this content each and every week. I want to thank you for tuning in, and I will catch you on the next episode.